So, just to introduce who I am. So I'm Stephen Boydell. I'm the Public Health Intelligence Lead in the Public Health team in Blackpool Council. And amongst other things, I'm responsible for our Joint Strategic Needs Assessment and needs assessment in general. So yeah, that's what I'm going to be talking a little bit about today. Some of you I know have these sort of responsibilities in your role, so you might well know more than me, and at least as much as me. So feel free at the end to add your thoughts. And I'm going to start just thinking about where our role as a public health analyst fits into the public health team before moving on to thinking about needs assessment and JSNA. So yeah, feel free to, well, I'm sure we'll have plenty of time at the end, and feel free to add any questions or comments in the chat as we go. So I just thought I'd go through what we have inherited as a public health team from the NHS. So public health moved from the NHS in 2013. And at that point in time, the NHS had a clear split between the provider part of the NHS, hospitals, GP practices, that sort of thing, and the commissioning part of the NHS, which at that time was primary care trusts, moved to CCGs, moved to ICBs, and all sorts of other things in the meantime. But there is that clear, distinct split between commissioners who held the money and the ultimate decision making about who should provide services. And that's the role, that's the side public health sat on at that point in time as a commissioner, and that's what we've inherited in and brought into the local authority. And we've in Blackpool we've carried on on that with that same role ever since. Now I know other public health teams around the country have moved some services into their local authority and they're provided by the local authority, but broadly we've not done that in Blackpool. So public health in Blackpool's basically a commissioning body to commission services to meet the needs of the population of Blackpool. There's lots of other things that public health do, but the bulk of the money the public health team in Blackpool Council spends is on those commissioned services. And those are things like drug and alcohol treatment, sexual health services, school visiting, health visiting, school nursing, stop smoking support, all sorts of things. We look after those contracts basically. And as such, we inherited this way of doing things from the NHS, so this commissioning cycle. And in Blackpool, it might be different in other areas. We've tried to stick with this approach. It's very hard to talk for public health teams as a whole because we've got much more authority to do things in the way we think suits us. So local authorities essentially they're their own little kingdom really, whereas the NHS is very much top down, that there's a way of doing things. Local authorities have a lot more freedom of how they do things. But anyway, in Blackpool we've stuck with this approach. So I thought I'd start by just going through this commissioning cycle that we try and stick to, and essentially it's our commissioning process. So it's a cycle, but you've got to break into the circle somewhere. So broadly, we start off by thinking about assessing the needs of the population. What are the health needs? What does our population look like? How do we meet those needs? And that's what I'll be talking mainly about. Then we move round. So this is in the red bit on the diagram. What are our current services doing? How well are they doing those things? Do they meet the needs of the population? Then thinking about what our priorities for improvement are. So that's where we're thinking about writing our strategy, thinking over a long period of time what we'd like to do, what we'd like to change, and coming up with some priorities, and from those priorities some actions that we'd like to take. And some of that will be both changes to how we commission services, but other things around that as well. So that's the planning phase. Going round into looking at designing services, we'll be working with our provider to shape how our services are provided, where they're located, who they serve, what they do. There's some bits that are more NHS-y around some of this, so looking further around the supporting patient choice through that's more of an NHS thing that's still in the commissioning cycle. But some of that will, some of the thought around services will be around the capacity. How big a service do we need? Can we manage the demand for that services? Are there people who aren't getting those services that we need to reach out to in a different way to get them, and to get them into the services they could benefit from? So then moving round to the monitoring and evaluation bit. Our job is then to check that those services we commission are performing well, and we have a process to do that. We have regular reviews with our providers. We have agreed information that will flow from our providers to help us do that. And then finally we're getting back towards assessing needs, and feeding into that assessing need of the population process is actually talking to the public and trying to seek the views of people who both use those services, particular services, are they happy with the services, and the public in general about what they need. So hopefully that makes sense as a cycle that we follow, and we've tried to work in that way since we moved across from the NHS. And so to do all those things, there's some functions that are needed to support all of those things, and that however we describe them as analytics functions, intelligence, whatever, however we want to describe them, but there's certain things. So assessing needs, clearly needs assessment, ultimately feeding into the joint strategic needs assessment, the JSNA, which we'll talk about more in a bit. Looking at the population, understanding our population, understanding the different levels of health risks for different people in the population. So that's the needs assessment bit. Further round, we'll have to understand what works, what's likely to work to meet those needs. So we'll be looking at the literature about what what the literature says about different ways of delivering services, what the evidence says actually works, and trying to appraise that evidence. And in some cases, we'll need to set up evaluation of the things we're commissioning, other things we're doing directly. Some of the other stuff we will be thinking about around how do we screen this population, how do we deliver things in the way that people can access them. So that's around that shaping supply, planning and capacity, demand management are the things that we do, or when we're working with the NHS, are they delivered in a way that best suits what people want? So we've done a lot of thought recently around vaccination, for example, and the services getting out to people where they can best use them. And actually Public Health has funded some additional sort of catch-up services for MMR vaccination, for example. So thinking about if there's different ways we can meet what people need. And then round finally to the managing performance, where we're monitoring the performance of those services and the effectiveness of those services. So thinking about what I do, what the public health intelligence community does, it's having those. This is quite an old slide, but I think it describes quite well those different things, different skills and roles needed by the public health intelligence community to undertake those functions to support the commissioning process. So there's these different steps from the stage of raw data and how that's handled. How do we turn that into useful information? How do we then convert that information into intelligence? So that's how do we gather that up and present it in a way that's useful to decision makers, essentially. And then the final stage is how do we make decisions? And I think one of the key things is that people in my sort of role, sort of public health intelligence role, really do need to be in those meetings where decisions are ultimately made. And I think that's something that hasn't always happened, but I'm, you know, please say it doesn't. It does work really well in Blackpool. So top row are those people and the skills they need to do these things, and then some of the things that need to in place for that to work. So lots of detail there, but that's broadly the different things a public health intelligence analyst needs to do. And there's an argument. There has been an argument that actually the roles sort of splitting into two parts, with the data and information side being more of a technical role and quite a skilled technical role, and the intelligence and support for decision making being a different kind of role involving working with senior leaders, report writing, evaluation. So there's an argument: can any one person hold all of these four tiers in their role? Because it's very, very broad. And I think what you tend to find is, as people stay in the public health intelligence role community, they tend to, as they progress and maybe go into more management roles, you end up further right on that on that chart. So I'm doing much more work around decision support, so to the right hand side of that. So some of you will be much more familiar with this than me, especially if you've got an academic background, but just wanted to get across the importance of understanding the evidence, and this is much more around quantitative stuff. It is absolutely important that the qual work's done and we talk to our community and talk to the users of our services, but this is more focused on the quantitative stuff. So essentially, this is, a lot of you, I'm sure, have seen this before, but the evidence goes from, at the bottom, someone's opinion, whether they're an expert or not, up through these different tiers, and the higher up the tier we go, the higher the quality of evidence, and ultimately the more sure we can be that this thing that's being reviewed is likely to work. And so that's really, really important for us when we're spending money on something, to have a good idea if it's likely to work. And just to think about those different steps, so going from expert opinion to mechanical type studies, so we know in the body, if this goes in the body, this is the likely outcome, to case reports, case studies of what one person, a handful of people, about what's seen by the medical profession, up through thinking about cross-sectional studies, which is looking at a cohort at a particular point of time in time, and that's what I do a lot of. So that's looking at the demographics of the current population, disease prevalence, mortality as it stands now, that sort of thing. Case control studies tend to be retrospective, so you're looking back at people with something and another group of people without a thing, so that's likely to be a disease in this case, and looking what were the factors that might have led up to that group that have the condition, why is that different from the group that don't have the condition. And you move up to cohort studies, which are studies where you look at a cohort of people over a period of time and look what happens to them over a period of time. Then right at the top with it, thinking about things like randomized controlled trials. So that's drug trials. How do we know if a new drug is going to work? And essentially, a lot of us are familiar with that. Essentially, you create two groups. You randomize people into those groups. It's blind, so the people in the groups don't know which group they're in, and the people intervening, so the doctors or whoever administering the intervention, don't know either. And one group gets something, the other one don't, and you look at the difference. And then at the top are studies that look across multiple systematic reviews are when you're looking across multiple studies to see if the studies are broadly saying the same thing repeatedly. So that's important when we're trying to decide what we spend our money on, basically. And if we're doing things where the evidence is, let's say, not there or just emerging, I think that's where we've got to slow down and decide how we're going to handle that, because that's quite a difficult situation for us to be in. At the bottom, we're talking about doing something that's new, or the context is very different. At the top, we have a huge amount, a lot of evidence that something's going to work. That might be NICE guidance. That evidence might have ultimately gone into NICE guidance, and that's telling us how we should deliver programs. And NICE guidance doesn't just exist for things that are delivered in hospital trust, it exists for public health interventions as well. So I think the key thing to say is most of the stuff we spend our money on in public health is at that top of the pyramid. So we spend our money on sexual health services. They're a clinical intervention. There's the evidence is at the top of the pyramid. There's NICE guidance around how to deliver stop smoking service, drug and alcohol treatments. We know how to deliver health visiting. So the stuff we spend most of our money on is at that top of that evidence pyramid, which is quite right. Most of our money should be spent on stuff we have a very good knowledge of. And in that case, there's the evaluation we do is going to be much more straightforward. So we'll be essentially saying, we think this thing is going to work. What we need to check that we're doing is we're doing lots of it. So counting the activity, checking we're doing lots of it, and checking we're doing it in a way that is the same as the guidance or the evidence base, wherever it is, says we should do it. So do lots of it, do it as we're meant to, and then checking the results of it. So auditing the results of it, and thinking about, are we getting value for money for that thing? So that's a fairly straightforward way to evaluate things, in my view, because that's what I do day to day, and that's how we monitor the services we commission are working. If we at the bottom of that pyramid, we're essentially doing something new, something different, and at that point, because it's new, essentially we've got we're uncertain if what we're doing is likely to work, and as such, we've kind of got a duty to add to the evidence base, because someone else might pick up and do it. We might carry on. Once you start something, it kind of goes on and on and on. So at that point, we've got to try and add to the evidence base, and to do that is really difficult, actually. And it's one of the reasons why, obviously, we spend most of our money on things that are very well evidenced, and we put less money, effort into those new things. This is not saying we should never do new things and try new things, but what it is saying is when we do, we should be aware that there's limited evidence, and aware that we should be trying to evaluate them properly. What have we got here? So, not to completely scare everyone, but when we're doing that new thing, we should be thinking about what our evaluation is like. And this is where I know my knowledge is really limited. And I think that's fine. When we're going into this territory of evaluating something new, the first thing I think is, I better get someone in to help me who's cleverer than me, because this is difficult. This is really difficult stuff. And throughout my career, I've seen evaluations done quite badly all over the place. But broadly, if we're doing a new thing, we should be trying to evaluate it in a way that's reasonable. And that may mean getting in some help. This is where I think we need some help, potentially from an academic, potentially for someone who's got some experience of doing this sort of thing. So this is just laying out some of the pitfalls. And if you're evaluating something new and it's being done, the evaluation is being done as it's laid out on the right hand side, where you're just measuring the outcomes before and after a program's introduced, and just looking at the group of people who are getting that that new intervention, there's no comparison. You're very, very, very likely to get misleading results. And I think, thinking back over my career, I've seen that done quite a few times. And essentially, you get problems like just measuring regression to the mean. So you identified a group of people who needing an intervention because they trigger a threshold. It's very likely that would fall back, whatever that trigger is, would naturally fall back whether the intervention was given or not. And that's the problem with these sorts of non-experimental evaluations. So it's not to say don't do it, it's to say know where your limitations are. And I certainly know where my limitations are, and it's around evaluating new novel things. It's difficult stuff. But so thinking about those things at the top of the pyramid, we actually have loads of sources of evidence provided by the national public health bodies. A lot of this says Public Health England, they've been superseded now, but they've been superseded by UCSA and OHID, and there's a library service. There's loads of stuff online about what works, what's been done elsewhere, what's been evaluated. So start there when you're looking at what to do to meet the issues in your area. There's a huge amount of good quality evidence to start with. So just jumping on to needs assessment and where that fits in. So this is essentially what feeds the JSNA, and it's trying to be quite systematic about looking at the health issues facing a population. For us, it's Blackpool, and it's trying to practically think about how we agree priorities and how we allocate resources to meet those challenges. It should be a holistic assessment, but you know, we have limited resource to do that. We do the best we can. And it's around understanding the needs that exist and planning the work to meet those needs, prioritising. And it should enable, because we should be doing this together, the commissioners to work closely with the people who are actually delivering the service to think about what the need is. So that it should be, needs assessment should be bringing people together to think, basically. And it's not a one-off process. It's continuous process, as the cycle kind of gives an idea of. It's a cycle. It goes round and round forever. It definitely feels that way sometimes. So here's one model of health needs assessment. So this one's from Scotland, and I just wanted to look at the step. These are the steps. I just wanted to look at step one, because broadly these are the sort of questions you're trying to answer with the needs assessment. So I'm not going to go through all of this, but a needs assessment should be asking some questions. So what are the population we're interested in? What are we trying to achieve? And then in terms of undertaking the health needs assessment, who needs to be involved in that? I certainly don't know everything. The public health team don't know everything. So if we're doing a needs assessment on housing, for example, we need people who really know about housing involved. What resources are required? And those resources might be people and time, but people and time are hard to tie down. And what are the risks around it? And I think there's, yeah, you can see the steps through the process. But thinking where you start is really important. I thought I'd bring this back up. One of the things we struggle with sometimes is the confusion between what a needs assessment is that'll feed into the JSNA and what other types of analysis are. And I think one of the things is try and do, and I think most of the time we get this right in public health, is be really try and make a clear distinction about why we're doing things. So if we're gathering information, gathering data, gathering information, providing it to decision makers, we're trying to be very clear that this set of information is a needs assessment, so it's for that particular part of the commissioning cycle. And that is not managing the performance of a service. So we might have some information around how the service is doing and who the service is supporting, but we're very clear about this process is assessing need. There's another process that we're involved in that is managing the performance of the service. So trying to move from let's just gather all the data we can, get all the information we can and throw it at people, trying to split it into very clear products that are everyone understands what they are and what they're for. Okay, so talked about needs assessment, joint strategic needs assessment. It became something that must be done in April 2008. And since then, local authorities, upper tier local authorities, sorry, have had a duty to do joint strategic needs assessment with their partner NHS commissioner, which started out as PCTs, then CCGs, now it's ICBs. So it has to be done at that upper tier footprint. It's a joint responsibility between the NHS and upper tier local authorities, and it's a product that comes out of health and wellbeing boards. It also is there to feed another product, another thing that health and wellbeing boards must do. So they must produce a joint local health and wellbeing strategy, and the JSNA should inform that. And that joint local health and wellbeing strategy is sort of the agreed priorities that all these partner organisations are going to try and work towards to improve the health and well-being of the population. So it's a joint duty of the NHS and local authority. It's also a health and wellbeing board product, and on the health and wellbeing board sits lots of different partner agencies, from voluntary sector organisations, police, fire service, all sorts of different local organisations. And if things are working well, we should be calling them in where appropriate to work on specific bits of needs assessment where they have the particular knowledge we're after. So it's there to promote a common understanding through all the partners of the Health and Wellbeing Board. And those partners should prioritise what they do based on the information gathered in the JSNA. And it should be there to inform effective decision making. I think the other thing to say is that they're public documents, so they're there for members of the public. They're there for any organisation in Blackpool to use. They're really, a lot of voluntary sector organisations find JSNA useful for writing funding bids, for example. So that background information they need to write a funding bid. The local college use the JSNA in teaching various courses there. And it's a two-way thing, so it's there as a source of information, but it's there as somewhere these organisations can feed information to share it more widely. So some of the key things we're looking at is what's changing over time. So are things improving, getting worse over long periods of time? So in public health, we tend to be thinking over years and years or decades to see if things change, which is quite a different timescale to when we're looking at what's going on in the services. We might be reviewing what's happening month on month in the services, but thinking about the change in health, we tend to be thinking over really long periods of time. And we also tend to compare with other areas, so that might be the country as a whole, the Northwest, our neighbours, Lancashire. It might be with statistical neighbours, so local authorities that are similar to ourselves. So comparing over time and against other places. And we're looking particularly for where inequalities exist between different communities, either within the town or between Blackpool and elsewhere, and trying to pick out any particular communities that have specific health needs that we might need to reach in a particular way. And this is where we struggle, and I think a lot of other areas struggle with their JSNA around bringing in the express views of the public. For a couple of reasons, I think. One, resource. The resource we have to undertake the JSNA. The JSNA in Blackpool is huge, and there's not a lot of resource goes into it. And essentially, the people leading JSNAs are generally like me, data analysts who became dentistry analysts, so they don't have to talk to the public really. So there's a bit of a mismatch with who's leading JSNA across the country and that outreach sort of work. So we've talked a bit about this, but those priorities out of the JSNA should be there to inform not just what the local authority is doing, not just what the public health team is doing, but in feeding into plans, strategies, action plans for all our local partners. And we should be able to see that link, and that's something that essentially is in legislation. So it's one of the things when the CQC come to inspect a local authority, they want to see the chain between needs assessment, partnership working into the JSNA, into your strategies, into the action plans, what have you actually changed? Ofsted are the same. So when the inspector comes in, they want to see that you can evidence that your decision making has been clear, logical, and run through from JSNA onwards. So what actually is it? How do we present it in Blackpool? So essentially, it's a great big website. We reviewed quite a few years ago how we delivered it. It did used to be lots of, well, 5 or 6 enormous reports that were presented as PDF reports that became a problem because you couldn't search them. There's problems with the size of them, accessibility. So we've moved it to quite a while ago now. We moved it so it's a website split into sections that describe the life course. So we run through from children to adults to older adults. And we try to have a common structure to each of the topics we cover. That's not always the case, but these are the sorts of things we're thinking about around what we include in there. Just to give a feel for so these are so when it talks about life course, this is the sections we split the JSNA website into. This is these are examples. This is not comprehensive. There's much more than this in there, but broadly we've got the profile Blackpool, so that's still the sort of demographic information, what's happening in terms of life expectancy, what's changing in the population, starting well, so that's younger age children through to developing well, older children, living and working well. We tend to split into these 3 categories, so particular health conditions, health protection, so looking at infectious diseases and how we tackle those, healthy lifestyle, so those are some of the factors that influence people's health, and those tend to be really quite big sections because public health has some direct, well, we have the knowledge there, and we have our commission services tend to be trying to tackle some of those things. Aging well, at the moment it's quite a small section, but we've thinking about older people and people and places. So we've got some information about specific groups in the population, and then those wider determinants of health. So those are those broad things that influence people's health. And talked about, mentioned housing before, what's going on with employment, deprivation, and those broad wider determinants of health. So that's kind of how we structure our website. And this is kind of the point I've been trying to hammer home recently, is if we're going to continue making this work, and particularly for those areas where public health doesn't have all the knowledge, the public health team doesn't have the knowledge, what we really need for each topic is we need people with expertise around doing a needs assessment. So public health has that knowledge. We really do need the topic expertise. Public health doesn't know about a lot of these wide determinants of health. It doesn't know around how adults and children's services operate. So we need that topic expertise when we're coming to write, think about doing needs assessment, actually write the thing. And we need, we have access to some information data, but we don't have access to everything, and we don't have access to everything the council holds on service users. We don't have information from the NHS, so we need not just access to data, we need the analysts who understand that data to be involved and be practically working with us. So partnership working is what we need for it to work, and we've got loads of really good examples of that loads of really good examples of that, but some frustrating experiences as well. And I think that very practical things we need to ask: who's the most appropriate person to interpret and write it? You need the knowledge in that area. Who is responsible for updating it? So once we write the thing, we could write a massive needs assessment. Is that a one-off? Well, it shouldn't really be. Then who's responsible for updating it? Where does that maintenance fall? And how often do we do it? So those are some of the practical things we need to think about, especially when we're taking on something enormous that might not sit in the public health world normally. So that was the presentation. I just thought I'd very quickly show the thing. So this is what it looks like in Blackpool, the JSNA. And I think it's really important to say everywhere has to do a JSNA, but they're all everywhere approaches this differently. So every JSNA looks different, and each will have its own strengths and some weaknesses. And that's great because it allows the focus to be on the right things for that local area. However, it's quite frustrating for people who are at a higher level and having to review multiple JSNAs. They all look different, so that's the downside. So just very briefly on some of the additional bits on our website, we have a library of our public health annual reports. All the previous public health annual reports are on here. We have a duty to do something called pharmaceutical needs assessment every 3 years, looking at pharmacies in we do the as across Pan Lancashire, looking at the coverage of pharmacies. So that's on here, and the joint local health and wellbeing strategy is published here as well, that we talked about before. But essentially, these are these 6 broad categories. So life expectancy is a good one, and this is what you'll see. So on life expectancy, you've got an explanation of what it is, some idea. It talks about what's happening, change over a long period of time, variation within the town. We've got we're looking at where Blackpool sits with other areas, and lots of other further information. So that's sort of a sample of a general page. Some are bigger than others, some because we have lots more information on some things. That's how we lay them out. You can lift text and reuse it. It's there to be used anywhere you want. I'd be grateful if you can reference the JSNA, that it came from the Blackpool JSNA, but feel free to lift things off it, lift pictures. The charts are just pictures, copy them off the website, just reference it if you could. And we have a search function, so if you're looking for things, hopefully this works, on here it will bring up relevant pages on our website if you search that way. The other thing is we've got an email, a specific JSNA, Blackpool JSNA email address that's there. Email us. Well, definitely email us if you've got something you want to add to the JSNA, want to work with us. That would be brilliant. If you've got any queries, you can't find something, even better if you've got some compliments to give us. That would be marvelous. But that's there for getting in contact with us. And that's basically what I wanted to cover today. I hope that's made some sense.